Welcome back everyone, I'm History with Hilbert, and this is Anglo-Saxon History Visualised, Episode 2, The Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms. Now if you didn't see the first episode about the Anglo-Saxon invasion, I would recommend you have a watch of that, because that's some good context and background for this one. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Now something I might not have mentioned too much in the previous video was that there were three main tribes who came to Britain from the continent, from Northern Europe. Now they were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Now there were probably some Frisians among them as well, but they didn't found any kingdoms by themselves like the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes did. So first of all, the Angles mostly settled along the eastern coastline of Britain. In the very northeast, they founded this kingdom of Bernicia, which I mentioned in the previous video. Now, it was likely that Bernicia will have been founded by either Roman auxiliaries, who were these Germanic auxiliaries serving the Romans on Hadrian's Wall, that they then invited their friends from Europe over to come over and to start this kingdom, and that they then held out at Bebbanburg, or as we now call it, Bamborough, in the northeast, as their stronghold. And actually, Bernicia stretched right the way up into Scotland to Edinburgh. And Edinburgh itself means the stronghold of Aidin. Although Aidin was the name of a Celtic Briton, the Burr part, also found in Bamborough in Bebbanburg in Old English, denotes an English influence. So what it meant was it was Aidin's stronghold. So it's quite interesting that we see, rather than it being a Celtic name or a Germanic name, it's a mix of the two. And actually you have this quite a lot. To the south of Bernicia, another set of Angles founded the kingdom of Deira around the city known to the Romans as Eboracum, the Anglo-Saxons as Ephawich, and to us as York. Now York is a very significant city, and etymologically it's very interesting and it goes through a lot of development. And again we see that the very kingdom of Deira, the name Deira, comes from a Celtic word, and it's also found in the Irish place name of Derry, no politics intended here, denoting either water or oak trees. So it's likely that if they were found in combination, that it would then be denoting some sort of sacred spring that was there, that was holy to the local population. And although I'm not going to be covering this in this video, in later videos I'm going to be talking about some more of the actual physical landscape and geography and some of the etymology here in this series, because it's very interesting to see that the Anglo-Saxons generally, they come and they name the place names in England, but the rivers, for example, they are almost all still Celtic in name, and that this retains even though the Celts are no longer the dominant group. But I'm going to get into that in a lot more detail in a future episode. And actually one of the largest rivers in Northumberland, close to where I live actually, is called the Derwent, and Derwent again comes from this same root shared in Deira, this Celtic root. Now East Anglia was also mainly founded by Angles, although there is as well evidence in this area that at least a small Frisian influence was present. For example, with the terms that the old farmers and the peasantry used to divide up the land. So say you've got, I don't know, acre and a borough and things like that. Well, the words that they used to describe those in East Anglia are very similar to those that they used in medieval Frisia just across the sea. And again, East Anglia was a trading hub, and the Frisians, what are they famous for? Well, trading. So it makes sense that there would be some Frisians going into East Anglia. But obviously, as the name suggests, it was founded by the Angles, and they were predominantly Anglian there. And as well, Murcia was also founded by the Angles, and Murcia took up most of the centre of the island, and it bordered on London actually. So if you know roughly where London is, then Murcia bordered on London, and London was actually the meeting point of 4 or 5 old kingdoms, because you had Essex, you had East Anglia, sometimes it was bordering Mercia, Wessex and Kent, depending on who had which land at the time. So it was quite an interesting one, London. The Saxons appear to have settled mainly in the south. Wessex was the strongest kingdom that they founded, and it literally meant land of the West Saxons. Now the name Saxon itself actually comes from the term for the long knives that they used, called the sax. And actually an interesting point about this is that the Saxons on the continent, I think, used longer knives than those who went to Britain. Now the reasons for this are debated, but I think it's quite interesting that you see this development from the, I think it's called the lang sax in Old English, from the continent, and that they used a shorter sax, or maybe scramma sax, in Britain when they came over. So that's an interesting comparison between the two. But the name Saxon does ultimately denote from this knife, this sort of, it's almost, I wouldn't call it a sword, but it's sort of in between a knife and a sword, I would describe it as. And The Saxons have settled all along the south coast, and this Sax suffix can be found in all the kingdoms that they founded. So you have Sussex, which meant South Saxons, and to the south of Wessex, which obviously I said West Saxons, and Essex, which was a lot larger than the modern county of Essex, and it was around sort of above the area that's now sort of Greater London, that kind of area. Now the final kingdom of Kent was settled by the Jutes, and again there is evidence for a Frisian influence which can be found linguistically, so in the Kentish dialect of Old English, which makes sense because Frisia is just across the channel. So I'm not sure what they exactly were. Now I did look into this for a dissertation that I wrote about the Frisians in England, which is why I keep going back to it, but I can have a look. But it's some quite complex rules and things that apply in both Old Frisian and in the Old Kentish dialect of Old English. Now, the famous scholar Frank Stenton coined the term the Anglo-Saxon Hatake, which meant the 7 largest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from, the Latin obviously, hept for 7. And these, the ones that actually survived the initial phase of migration and invasion, were Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent, East Anglia, Murcia, and a newly formed kingdom of Northumbria. And Northumbria is an interesting one because it was formed when the previously mentioned kingdoms of Deira in the south and Bernicia in the north joined together under one king, and this happened at some point in the early 7th century. And the name Northumbria, if you couldn't guess, actually meant north of the Humber. The Humber being the river that sort of sticks out. It's almost, if you know where the border between England and Scotland is, it's almost roughly a third of the way up England. That's the Humber, sort of where Northumbria stops, the A of Northumbria stops. So everything north of there was seen as the Humber, although obviously it had Cumberland and things. But that's where the name comes from. And the larger kingdoms of the Heptarchy often invaded the smaller ones and made them vassals or made them pay tribute or something like that. For much of the 8th century, Kent was a vassal of Murcia, and for much of the 9th it was a vassal of Wessex, so both of these kingdoms exerted power over the smaller ones. Now Sussex was a vassal of both Wessex and Murcia for much of the 7th to the mid-9th centuries. Now power in England then often shifted between Murcia and Northumbria, and they were almost always at war with one another, as well as the Celts to the north and west. So the Mercians, for example, they hated the Welsh just as much as they hated the Northumbrians, and the Northumbrians were often fighting against the Cumbrians to the west, and when they managed to subdue the Cumbrians, they would then fight against sometimes the Picts, sometimes the Scots from Ireland, or, well, debatable if they're from Ireland, but that's another video, or the men of Strathclyde, who were another Brythonic kingdom. And there's actually a very nice old sort of Celtic poem which is called the I think it's called the I Gododin, which is about this slaughter of a Celtic tribe who tries to, I think they were trying to hold on to their land that was being invaded by the Northumbrians, and they're all killed at that battle. And I think there's one theory that I Gododin was the old Celtic kingdom around Edinburgh that then obviously the Northumbrians captured from them. So who knows, the king of I Gododin might have been this Aidin that's still found in the name Edinburgh. In the late 6th and early 7th centuries, King Edwin of Northumbria captured North Wales and actually even sent a fleet to invade the Isle of Man to increase his power. However, after defeating and slaying him at the Battle of Hatfield Chase, a joint force of Welshmen and Mercians ravaged Northumbria, and this went on until this guy called Oswald returns from exile. And who was Oswald, you might ask? Well, King Edwin killed a king called Alfred, who was also a very strong Northumbrian king who invaded south. And when he killed Alfred, he became king of Northumbria. But lo and behold, Alfred had 2 sons, and one of them was King Oswald, so that's how he had a claim to the throne, if you're interested. Now, I really like King Oswald. He's a really cool guy, and I'm going to make a few videos about him. And there's actually a very good book about him called The King in the North, which I would recommend you read if you want to find out more about how, the Northumbrians in the 7th century and that kind of thing. So I would recommend that. But the Northumbrians then, under King Oswald, they return from exile and they unite the men of the north and defeat the Mercians and the Welsh. And under Oswald, the Northumbrians actually expand their kingdom south of the Humber, which, should they then be called Southumbrians or Midhumbrians, who knows? And they forced the Mercians to yield. So Northumbria was quite powerful, but for most of the time, actually, it was the Mercians who were the powerful ones. And despite Northumbria's periods of glory for the 3 centuries between sort of 600 to 900, Murcia was the real power, the most powerful kingdom. And the era was known as the Mercian supremacy because the Mercians at this point controlled all the land south of the Humber, although the Northumbrians managed to keep them from uniting all the lands of the English-speaking peoples by retaining their independence. However, that would happen only after the next episode of Anglo-Saxon History Visualised, The Coming of the Danes. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching this second episode of Anglo-Saxon History Visualised. If you have any questions about anything that I covered in this video, then please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'd be very happy to answer them. Alright everyone, if you're new, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and to tune in again next week for episode 3 of Anglo-Saxon History Visualised, The Coming of the Danes. Alright everyone, thanks for watching.